They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us and welcome to another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Jennifer Horn.
And I'm Katie Gorka.
And so happy to welcome back, and this is a first, by the way, a returning guest to the Happy Women Podcast. So excited to have her. She gave us such great information the last time she was here. Victoria Snitsar Churchill is here with us. She is out on the campaign trail, an incredible writer. And we welcome you back to Happy Women. Thanks so much for being here, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me back. Honored to be here.
Well, it's awesome to have you. And of course, we are, as we record this, just less than, almost 3 weeks. Is it 3 weeks away? I think that's where we are right now from Election Day. Holy smokes, it is flying by. We've got early voting going on. We've got President Trump, who is just in my home state of California over the weekend. He says he's going to go to Madison Square Garden and he is going to Atlanta for big rallies. This is going to be a lot of fun. So just before we jump into all of the specifics about stuff that's been happening, since we last talked a few months ago, Victoria, where do you think we are right now? What's the state of the race?
Well, I think Trump and Republicans nationwide and down ballot races as well are picking up steam. And I think they are in a very good position considering that we are just about 3 weeks away from Election Day. You know, even the Trump campaign predicted, I think this was right around the time when obviously we had Harris enter the race was the last time that we talked. And, you know, even like I said, even the Trump campaign predicted that there would be a sort of honeymoon period, both in the mainstream media and with donors and, you know, even with supporters kind of flocking to Harris after seeing Biden drop out. But I really do think that time is over and people are starting to come to their senses. And that's going to lead to a majority of them supporting Trump and Republicans up and down the ballot.
So what are some of the big developments that you would say you've seen in the last month or two? Now, of course, we have to talk about the assassination attempts. But aside from that, do you see any particular activities, for example, any of the lawsuits or any of the endorsements? Do you see anything that has on either side of the aisle, whether Trump or Harris, do you see anything that has, you think, definitively helped move the needle one way or another?
Well, I think for Trump, one of the big things that we have to look at, obviously, is the selection events. I think that every single time that his team puts him on, you know, Sunday shows, mainstream media, he is able to hold his own, which, you know, even Harris, she started to do a few more media appearances on very friendly to her media, but she doesn't fare as well. And, you know, even we've seen some of these clips come out from some of her other major interviews that one clip is what they use in the promotion and then they air the actual interview and it's completely different. And so this idea that the mainstream media is in lockstep with the Democrat Party, you know, some people on our side of the aisle will kind of peg that even as a conspiracy theory. But then when clips like that come out, you say, well, you know, you must think that this is not real. Here it is. Like, here is this content that they are putting out themselves. And it is still, you know, very visibly altered or changed. And so, you know, with that, just seeing all these live hits that Vance does. And like I said, he holds his own. He doesn't let these hosts all over the mainstream media, he doesn't let them become entrenched in their narrative. He's able to pick it apart. You know, that's probably in part due to the fact that he is a Ivy League educated lawyer. But, you know, really, I think that really plays to the Team Trump strengths. And that's something that I've been hearing from voters as well, is that a lot of people were kind of unsure about Vance as the pick. Not many people, really even myself to some extent, knew too much about him, but he's really been able to hold his own. I think his rallies are becoming a lot better attended as well. That's something myself and my colleagues have noticed. You know, his first few rallies, obviously nobody expects, I think, Trump-sized crowds, but, you know, he did struggle a little bit getting some people in the door in the beginning, but I think that's changed drastically over the last few weeks.
You know, I've noticed that too. And I think I was pretty neutral on J.D. Vance. I didn't think it was a bad choice. I didn't know if I was overwhelmed. But more and more, the more that we see him, the more that we're learning about J.D. Vance, he is able to fight, but he does it with a smile on his face. And I would reference, and maybe Misty, you can add the clip in here, JD Vance on the Sunday shows this last week talking with Martha Raddatz, and she's calling him out, or she was calling Trump out for talking about the Venezuelan gangs taking over the apartments in Aurora, Colorado, where President Trump was doing a rally last Friday. And she said, it's only a handful of apartment buildings. And he stopped her and said, do you hear your question here, Martha? Do you hear the question that it's okay that a few apartment buildings are being taken over by Venezuelan migrants led into the country by Kamala Harris and Joe Biden? It's ridiculous, but you're seeing the media do this more and more. And I think JD Vance has been really able to fight back, but he does it almost in that happy warrior style. And I saw something that I thought was really cool on your X account, Victoria. You had pinned that the winner of the vice presidential debate would be the one who would ultimately go on to win the presidency. Why did you feel so strongly about that? And do you agree that JD Vance pulled it off?
I absolutely do think that, that was from a hit I did actually after the first Trump-Harris debate. I actually had the privilege of traveling in the press pool with Vance on debate day. So I was in the spin room when he kind of offered up his takes. And then after that, I had a chance to join a show on Sky News Australia where I was talking about how, the left really likes to spin, particularly abortion, as this massive issue. And it's like, that's not what regular voters are talking about. That might be what, social media keyboard warriors are talking about. But voters day in and day out, no matter what event I'm at, what state I'm in, they talk about, I pegged it as the three prongs of security. It's personal security, it's national security, and it's economic security. And I think that still holds as true as it did 6 weeks ago, as it did 6 months ago, as it will on election day. I think those really are going to be the motivating factors for people that come out and support Trump and Republicans. And again, these aren't necessarily your super hoorah conservatives, but at the end of the day, they know that these are the issues that matter. And so even if they might be kind of not as gung-ho on Trump, they know that his policies, as we've seen from his first administration, are issues that win for the American people, and they're going to want to get back to that. And so I think they might not show up in polling because, again, they might have some qualms with the man and the way that he says things. And, this is even something that Vance has kind of gotten in trouble for from the mainstream media. But as I always like to talk about when I go on programs like this, like to them, it's the issue at large. It's not these small kind of intricacies, but like Springfield, Ohio, for example, that was something that I covered pretty extensively. I actually had a chance to ask Vance about it on his plane after the debate a few days afterwards. And, he told me that no matter how things are said, there is a very real crisis that is caused by a massive influx of migrants. And that's the issue that we need to be paying attention to. And, I think he really reiterated that, like you just referenced, Jennifer, on one of the more recent shows that he did, is that these are failures of policy and American citizens all around the nation are paying the price.
Volatility and uncertainty are everywhere we turn. Many Americans have grown increasingly tired of the reckless fiscal spending, mounting national debt, and the looming threat to the dollar. With never-ending political and global conflicts, Americans are looking for a way out of the fragile paper system and craving a trustworthy asset to help protect their savings. That's why they turn to gold, specifically a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. If you have over $100,000 in a retirement account, it's time you learned about the potential benefits of a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. Augusta Precious Metals is a world-class organization that prides itself on top-notch service. Ready to learn more? Get your free guide on gold IRAs today by calling 855-222-6994. Volatility is everywhere. Now is the time to take control of your retirement to secure a brighter financial future with Augusta Precious Metals. Call them at 855-222-6994 today. I want to talk about another issue that I've been hearing a lot about lately, which is education. So Saturday night, I was at an event with a lot of Hispanic voters. And the number one issue for them was what's happening in the schools. I was talking to people there who were legal but more recent immigrants, And they were telling me stories about how they've had to take their kids out of the public schools and put them into their local church school. And it was a great event, actually, because this was an event for a race that I know you and I are watching closely, which is the Virginia 7th District congressional race between Derek Anderson, the Republican, and Vindman, the Democrat. This is a very, very close race, and it's a very important race for Virginia, I would say. And Anderson was there speaking, but, as he was talking, and he's actually got an incredible story as well, raised by a very, very young mother. I think he said his mom was 18 when he was born, and she raised the boys by herself and had a market and a little restaurant, like a diner. And yet here he is. I think he went to law school. He's now running for Congress. It's a pretty amazing story. But what really stood out for me were the people in the audience, these Hispanics. And when he talked about education, and the moderator at some point turned to the audience and said, what is the most important issue for you? It was education. And it was the economy. And I think it's the education one in particular that's going to turn a lot of people moving to the Republican Party that I think the Democrats have been counting on, particularly in the immigrant populations.
Absolutely. I want to hit on a couple points on that. I always talk about immigration. I myself am an immigrant. My husband is an immigrant. We have two very different immigration stories. I came here when I was 3 years old. I became a citizen at 14. It took my family 11 years to go through the process the right way. And then my husband came here for college. He got his citizenship about a year and a half after he applied for it. So he became a citizen just about 6 or 6.5 years after he came to the States for college. He lived there for 5 years. That's kind of the typical period that you have to live in the country before you can apply to become a citizen. And then, that process takes its own amount of years. And again, it kind of varies based on my own personal experience, kind of when you actually enter the pool and through which route you choose to become a naturalized citizen. But that's actually an issue that kind of is very near and dear to my heart, because I went to very good public schools, both kind of K through 12, as well as, I went to a public university. I went to the University of Kansas, and that's actually another tangent we can go on. I don't know if you saw what happened with the professor there a few days ago.
Got to come back to that. Absolutely.
We can come back to that, because that's kind of my origin story of how I actually kind of got involved in the conservative media, was covering crazy leftist professors. But back to the modern day today, I see communities just like the one that I grew up in, even though I grew up on the West Coast. Northern Virginia is actually culturally very similar. Mm-hmm. And so what we see in these communities is that, for them, they want to come here just like my family did, and they want to pursue the American dream. And having a good education is a very critical component of that. And, as we saw kind of in 2021 with the Youngkin election, that's really an issue that gets, again, not people that are super conservative, but people that just want common sense policies. They tend to vote with Republicans, especially in states like Virginia. And I think kind of a testament to how far left the Democrat Party has gone on this issue is that, I think if Kamala Harris actually wanted to win this election, she would have picked Josh Shapiro to be her vice presidential nominee from Pennsylvania. I think Republicans would have been in a lot worse position than we are now if she had made that pick. But in my personal view, which I haven't heard too many people talk about, is that Shapiro is actually pretty moderate on education. He's pretty pro-school choice. And I think that Kamala Harris saw that she actually would lose the support of teachers unions, which are so entrenched within the Democrat Party, that I think that's actually one of the major reasons, outside of Shapiro's Jewish faith, that he was actually not picked to be the vice presidential nominee. But, if we're playing policy and not identity politics, to me, that's actually something that, again, I think for her would have actually really helped bring her pretty heavily towards the middle, but she just knows that these major voices and powers to be in her party would have never let that slide. I think, again, is kind of one of the key issues. And so when we look at that race, that Anderson-Vindman race, I think Anderson is a testament to the American dream, as you kind of alluded to, Katie, the story that he's been through with his mom. His mom ran a diner and a gas station. And, he talks about that at just about every event that he has. His mom comes to these events frequently, I know, because I've seen her there. And so when you look at the Anderson-Vindman race, that's one that I think is actually very representative of our national politics, where, the Democrats just put a bunch of money in and they think that that's going to win them the race. Vindman was actually disliked by a lot of very entrenched Democrats here in Virginia politics in the primary, because even they didn't like this amount of national money coming into a Northern Virginia race. He's kind of made amends, at least publicly, with a lot of those voices that didn't like him in the primary. But that really seems to not be helping him at all, because when you look at the Cook Political Report, which is, kind of taken as the best prognosticator nationwide for some of these races, first, when Abigail Spanberger left that seat, that was a likely Democrat seat. Then it went to lean Democrat. And last week it shifted to a toss-up seat. And these kind of suburban districts are exactly what Republicans need to hold in November if they have any hope of doing it. And so Vindman's just been parroting national Democrat talking points. He hasn't been doing too many events in the community, versus Anderson I see constantly out. And even on the issue of immigration, I actually ran a story. I believe we were the first outlet to run it over at the New York Post. Vindman, who himself is an immigrant. So hear this, right? This is obviously a very big part of his campaign story and his personal story. He had a public position on immigration during the primary, and he actually removed that stance off of his website for the general election, which it's like, why would you do that? Like, everybody knows that this is an issue that, you yourself care about very deeply. And it was gone. And so we flagged that and, kind of brought it into the ether. And I don't think it picked up as much steam as I think it should have had. But it's like, why are you trying to hide these policy positions? To me, the answer is that you're trying to really resonate with some very radical voices, because his initial immigration position is he actually did want to do some things like strengthening the border and things like that. And that's all gone. And so nobody's going to know that, at least when they're voting for him.
Insane. And just because you brought it up and because I wanted to go there anyway, and we're kind of in the same vein of schools, let's take a break from all of these election issues for a second, because one of the things I think many of us have noticed, and a lot of parents are questioning the schools, is obviously curriculum and, of course, the left-wing indoctrination, especially when our kids get to college level. So take us through how, first of all, a little bit of background, just again, on your story about these liberal professors, but there was some good news, actually, that's worth celebrating for these professors. I think they can just get away with anything, I think, with the kids in their class.
Yeah, so this story was from where I went to school, the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk Jayhawk. I sent that, I think I tweeted that out with like a grimacy face, like, oh, are we really saying this about my school that's in the news for all the wrong reasons? But I really saw firsthand the leftist indoctrination on campus during my time as a student on campus. I like to say I was a lot more libertarian before I went to college, and then college actually turned me into a pretty crazy right winger, unlike kind of what we see happen to a lot of people that are my age. They go to college and they become complete leftists. But again, I saw how radical and how crazy the leftists are on campus, and that, I think, really pushed me the opposite way. But what happened with this professor, so he was a professor, this isn't a political class. Actually, I realized after the fact that I knew this guy because I was a student athlete during my time in college, and he actually worked in the athletics department outside of his professional tenure and teaching classes and things like that. So he actually used to work with the international student athletes. And so he was part of like the academic support that is for the athletes. So I actually realized I had crossed paths with him a number of times. But what he said was that he believes that people that aren't going to support a woman for president, aka Kamala Harris, need to be lined up and shot. And this was a recording that was pulled from his classroom. And if that's not bad enough, he goes, after saying that, scratch that from the recording. I don't want the deans to know what I'm saying.
You think?
So
oh my
that
goodness.
clip went totally viral. A bunch of alumni, including myself and a lot of other conservatives that I know, spoke out. Senator Roger Marshall, who's one of the senators from Kansas, I saw him post about it, and he said that he reached out to the administration. So that man is no longer employed at the University of Kansas, but I kind
As
of
it should
that
be.
story. Yeah, so he was placed on probation and kind of review first, and then they said that he wasn't employed by the university anymore.
Well, I have to say that in itself is good news, because I feel so much of the time when this kind of thing happens, somebody gets like suspended with pay for 6 months and then they're brought back on to full status. So I hope it'll be interesting to see if he ends up somewhere else, if they bring him back, whatever.
Yeah, so it will be interesting to see. Actually, it's interesting that he works for the athletic department, because the athletic department is basically kind of its own corporation outside of the university. So I'm interested to see whether he's actually employed still by the athletics department, because I think if I knew of this situation, like that's probably one way they could weasel around it, saying, he doesn't teach anymore, but he still works in KU. And, again, I'm not saying that happened, but I think that would be a very good way that they could get around this. Because again, universities just love to pull crazy stuff like that. But this was actually how I started my journey in the conservative movement and in media specifically. I had some similar stories. So campus carry was a huge thing when I was in college, and we had one professor in particular that showed up to class in a bulletproof vest and basically said, so that was one professor. There's another professor that I wrote about that said, if you come see me in office hours, don't bring your gun. So that was kind of one of the first stories that I ever wrote for the Leadership Institute's campus reform. So that was back when I was a college student. And like I said, that was kind of my first foray into doing things like this, doing media hits and really showing how crazy the left is, especially at that time on college campus. But like I said, to me, it was kind of a full circle moment. I like tweeted and I made TikToks about it. And I was like, report your leftist professors, because standing up for your free speech and your rights on campus, it could even get you a career like it has for me. So it was really kind of a full circle moment that it's like, wow, like now I get to have a job working for the New York Post. And this is exactly the kind of situation that really blossomed from. So
before you jump in, Katie, with your next question, can I ask you just a quick one on that, Victoria? Because I actually feel like there has been a shift with young people, and not that Katie and I aren't young people like you are, but we're just got a few more years on you. But what is your feeling? And I know we don't even have to have hard data, but for instance, we had Trumpchella this weekend. We had President Trump at Coachella, and that's where they have these big music festivals, for those of you who haven't heard. And so on my program, on my radio show on Monday morning, I asked people to call in, and people were stunned by the number of young people that they saw at this event. People from UCLA, people from all the local universities who went out to see President Trump speak. Do you feel like there is a shift? Because it used to be the Democrats owned young voters. They probably still do, but are things shifting around a little bit?
Well, as the people in Gen Z, which I am barely a Gen Z, I'm right on the cusp of Gen Z and millennial, but Gen Z likes to say that this is a vibes election. That's what they're all saying. That was kind of again, as part of the Kamala Harris honeymoon period. This was one of the things that was, brat girl summer and endorsements of all the celebrities and things like that. So I think young voters are, for a large part, still owned by the left. But I do think there is hope. Obviously, one thing that I think we actually might have talked about last time I was here is kind of the split between young men and young women, which, thankfully I am married, so I don't have to date. But my heart goes out to all my friends that have to date in this environment, especially, women, because even some men, I think, take their conservatism a little too far, which is its own. And like I said, we can do its own episode on that. But hopefully, I think that as young women in particular, go out, get jobs, start paying taxes, see how hard it is to try and pay rent, especially in a major metropolitan area all by yourself, and you kind of look around and say, who are the leaders and what policies did we have to get there? I think there are some slight shifts that are happening in their brains. I do see a lot of young voters out at these events, but to me, it's actually really interesting. Like, I see a lot of people that aren't even voting age yet. So they're 15, 16, 17 years old. And that's actually, I think, how young some of these supporters are. So, and I think that's the next generation. I think that's Gen Alpha is what they technically are. So I think Gen Z might be a little bit lost, but if they can learn from millennials a little bit and Gen Alpha a little bit, maybe they'll start to shift. And again, obviously, as they get older, that's kind of what happens is people tend to vote more conservative. I do feel a little bit like an outside voice, I'd say even interestingly, along some friends that I had that used to be involved in the conservative movement, and they actually, unfortunately, have become a little bit more liberal. But, again, I think overall there is a bit of a shift. And, obviously I think that plays more to the male audience. But, Trump is doing all these podcasts. Like he's doing these, 30-minute long, 45-minute long, hour-long interviews that the mainstream media isn't getting, right? Like if we go and talk about this, he's going on Theo Vaughn. I think he's going to go, or he was already on the Sean Ryan show. Sean Ryan did an episode with Vance and with Trump. He's got Joe Rogan coming up, I believe, this week. So, those are the kinds of voters that he wants to reach. And, to the strength of platforms like this, podcasts, he's not going to reach them through the mainstream media. And right. I think those are all good signs. And, he said he asked his son, Barron, who he should go on. And, again, I think a lot of us have friends that are political consultants and things like that, and they do have good ideas. But sometimes you do need somebody that's not in the room to bring these fresh ideas. And I think a lot of our traditional political consultants aren't necessarily best equipped to tell Trump how to reach young voters. And so I think he is doing some very good things in that regard.
I love that you brought this up. I was going to bring it up if you didn't, because I actually think it is so smart. Not only that he's been doing these podcasts, which aren't famous, most of them, but that he's
they're not famous to you though. That's
no.
The thing, is that right. It's a completely different demographic. It's outside of everything that's in a political playbook, but these people have audiences of, millions, tens of millions. So it is reaching a group that, even people like us that are very much, I think, in the political realm, we don't even see them as noteworthy.
No, it's exactly the point. I remember a conversation that really struck me that I had with our son and his best friend. They're both super conservative. I mean, they're really, really solid. And after an election, I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago. No, it was 2 years ago. And I asked them if they were going to vote. Okay, so these are young guys in their early 20s. And I asked them if they were going to vote. And they said no. And their reason for it was they said no candidate had earned their vote. And I'm thinking to myself, what?
Wow.
Yeah, it made me kind of upset, and I make my son vote now. But I think that it sort of said something interesting to me, which is, look, I don't think that politicians should have to earn our votes, but in a weird way, the reality is they kind of do, right? They kind of do have to win us over. And especially when you think about the fact that, even though we get really what we all consider to be terrific turnout on presidential elections, that's 80%. That still means 1 out of 5 people is not voting. So the fact that Trump has chosen to go on to all these platforms, which are, many of them are probably the only place that a lot of these young people are getting their news. Or the other thing is, and I think this is a really insidious force that we have to be cognizant of, the fact that most of our kids, or let's just say kids in general, are getting so much information from their phones, which means it's like Apple News, right? Or they're seeing what Google puts into the news feed. So unless they're going to a source that can break through that, they're not going to hear the conservative message, right? So I think it's really brilliant that Trump is doing it. But how do you feel about it? Do you think this is important? Because Joe Rogan said for the longest time he would never have Trump on. Do you think this is a sign of bigger things to come, that Rogan is having Trump on the show?
I hope so. It's interesting, even talking about people like Dave Ramsey, right? He said he reached out to both camps. I think intrinsically, a lot of the types of people that Dave Ramsey reaches with his messaging would probably be very favorable to Trump's messaging, but he was willing and able, or he wasn't able because Kamala said no, but he was willing to give both camps a platform. And, like I said, Trump said yes and Kamala said no. And, again, I think that just goes to show that he's not afraid. Obviously, he has a lifetime of basically being on camera. And so I think that definitely plays to his strengths. And Kamala's scared, right? Like, she doesn't do unscripted, unedited interviews. She does town halls where she has a teleprompter. She's just so not good, right? Like, if we're talking about vibes, the vibes are off. If she's got to have a teleprompter for a town hall, the vibes are not good.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I think it's because she doesn't really stand for anything. I think she's a transactional actor. I've been saying it for a long time. President Trump, whether you like him or you don't, you know what he stands for. He knows what he stands for. He knows what he delivers, and that's why he can do interviews, and she can't. They have to tell her what to say to each group of people. It's really pretty incredible. All right, in our final moments here, you are the swing state reporter. You write for the New York Post. You're incredible. You've got a great intuition, Victoria, about what's happening. So let's go with what we should know in the swing states that are going to determine this election. I'll let you lead this one. What should we be keeping an eye out for over the next 3 weeks? And where do you think this thing goes?
Well, obviously,
It's no secret. The world's unpredictable. One moment, everything's fine, and the next, the power's out and the cell towers are down. But with a satellite phone from sat123.com, you don't have to be cut off from the world. No matter where you are or what's happening, Sat123 keeps you connected. Whether you're deep in the mountains, on the road, or dealing with a natural disaster, your satellite phone will work when nothing else does. This is about being prepared. Sat123.com is family owned, American built, and focused on keeping you safe. They understand that in today's world, connection is more than convenience. It's essential. So here's the deal. Go to sat123.com and use code Katie for $25 off your first purchase. Don't get caught off guard. Stay connected. Stay prepared with Sat123.
Pennsylvania, lots of eyes are on there, lots of dollars are being spent there. But I think some very positive signs for Republicans are that Senate candidate Dave McCormick has made up a pretty big deficit. Earlier in the summer, he had about a 14-point deficit to incumbent Senator Bob Casey. Now he's within a couple of points, almost maybe within the margin of error. McCormick is running a true grassroots campaign. Shoe leather. He's holding, I like to call them the grass tops events, right? He's meeting with community leaders all up and down the Commonwealth. And I really don't see Bob Casey doing the same thing. He's been the senator, I think, for 3 terms, so 18 years. So maybe he feels like he doesn't have to get out there as much. But McCormick is really putting in the work, and I think it's showing. I believe Emerson had the latest poll that has him quite close. And, again, that gap keeps shrinking, which I think is a positive sign. Now, they did kind of have basically Casey, like I said, winning by a couple points, and then actually Trump down a couple points as well. So I don't know how much, Trump doing well will kind of create coattails for McCormick. Or I've actually talked to a couple of voters that are pretty set on McCormick and they're a little bit undecided on Trump. And so for them, actually maybe McCormick might drive out some voters that Trump might not necessarily attract. So there kind of might be a two-way coattails, I guess, would be the best way to frame that. So that's definitely very important. North Carolina is another very critical state. I was just, reading today that the North Carolina Board of Elections is saying just about every polling site in Western North Carolina that needs to be open will be open. They're, talking to voters and things about making sure they get to the polls. But outside of having the methodology available and kind of the mechanism to cast those votes, I really hope those people, even though they're probably dealing with some very tragic personal things, I hope that they do get out to vote. That's kind of my next concern is, are they able to? Yes, but they probably, they're trying to get to insurance companies and they're trying to get to their job that's been, flooded and their businesses are gone. And so they have some very heavy things to deal with. And so I hope they are able to go to the polls in spite of that. But that's kind of something, as I put on another show the other day, like that's kind of outside of the realm of political science. Like these are very personal decisions that every single person is going to have to make. And, even as somebody that's been in this business and been covering this business, I don't know what percent of voters are not going to be able to go just because that's not going to be important for them. And so I hope it's not a lot, but I do think it will have some impact, again, kind of regardless of steps that are being taken by the government. And then, Katie, another one that you alluded to, yes, I think here in Virginia 7 is going to be very important, especially at a time when some very vocal members of the Republican caucus, like Marjorie Taylor Greene is one that comes to light. She's saying she doesn't think Republicans deserve to hold the majority. And, in some ways, I think I actually kind of agree with her a little bit, right? Like Republicans have had the majority. And I think the main thing that they've accomplished this year is getting rid of a speaker and getting a new speaker. But in terms of actual policy wins for the country, I don't think a lot of them have too much to point to, unfortunately. And so, it's going to be a hard sell in some of these districts for voters. And, I think the numbers that I was looking at is like a third of both caucuses are retiring because they just feel like Washington is so dysfunctional. They can't get anything done because they knew they wouldn't have anything to bring to the table for voters as actual accomplishments. And so I hope that the Republicans, especially in the tight races, are able to make that sell to voters. But it's definitely an uphill climb. I think in the Senate, we are looking better than we are in the House. Obviously, we're looking at picking up West Virginia pretty easily. Montana is another state where we have John Tester, and Sheehy is the Republican that's in that seat. So he's doing a lot better. And, even though he's definitely far from my favorite Republican, probably my least favorite, but he would at least have an R next to his name. In Maryland, Larry Hogan, I think, actually has a shot. Again, I don't think he would vote with a lot of Republicans, and he's made that pretty clear by the policy positions that he has adopted to get those more middle of the road voters. But again, at least he has a vote that, maybe on some fiscal policy, probably not so much social policy, but on fiscal policy, he may be able to side with Republicans, if he is elected. So, we may even have 3 seats that we pick up for Republicans in that chamber as well.
Well, I think it's a great overview, and there is a lot to unpack over the next 3 weeks. And I think you're right. I think the Senate does look better than the House, but man, oh man, do we need to win that House? Because if President Trump gets elected on day one, a Democrat-led House of Representatives will start impeachment operations against him. You can be sure of it. Dollars to donuts. So we'll see what happens. Victoria Snitsar Churchill, thank you so much for coming back and giving us some of your information that you've been collecting in the New York Post and other outlets. Follow her online, victoriasnitsarchurchill.com. Thank you so much, Victoria. Always great to see you. And we thank you for supporting the Happy Women podcast. Please continue to leave us those 5-star reviews, share our podcast with your friends, and you can connect to all the platforms that we deliver this program on at salempodcastnetwork.com. You can also check out Katie Gorka's website, katiegorka.org. You can get her book, Next Gen Marxism, wherever you get your books. Amazon's a great place for that. And of course, follow her on Facebook, just search for Catherine Gorka. On X, Gorka Katie. And you can find me too, Facebook and Instagram, Jennifer Horn Radio, and on Truth and X, it's at Jennifer Horn. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.